Recording begins. It is October 24th. This is ESM 105. We are going to wrap up our biodiversity PowerPoint today. That's the week 7 through 8 PowerPoint. And then next week we'll get into ecological economics. November 2nd is your next quiz. It's going to cover the week 7 through 8 PowerPoint, being the biodiversity PowerPoint. Please remember to continue working on your annotated bibliography and to continue participating in the weekly discussions, which become open every Friday and are open until Sunday. All right? Cool. Here we go. It's week 9, right? Let's just get this week done while learning some fascinating aspects of habitat management. Okay, so in our last PowerPoint, I was talking to you about creating new habitats, all right? And in creating new habitats, I introduced micro, meso, and then macro scale habitat creation, which is what we're going to talk about a little tiny bit today. And then we'll get into some more aspects of habitat management as we move forward. So micro habitat creation, what I'm talking about here are making very small habitats that give, say, nesting sites for animals, or provide small refugia for animals, or make little patches of ideal conditions where the animals can recover or persist without being bothered. Now, taking that last statement of persisting without being bothered, we're going to add in that piece that, hey, maybe you bother these animals a little bit. You use these sites, these microhabitats, for surveying purposes. If you want to know which insect species or which reptile species are present in a given area, make an ideal habitat for insects, make an ideal habitat for reptiles, and then go and survey them. Mesoscale habitat creation. So it's the middle scale, meso for middle, okay? This could include things like you make a pond, all right? You make a hedgerow. Hedgerows are very important in managing bird populations and insect populations because they serve as linear features that provide a big patch of habitat and nesting area. So you might hear about hedgerow management. And mesoscale habitat creation is smaller scale, so it's a smaller amount of management needed, smaller amount of resource investment required. Now, just making a habitat isn't the same as necessarily making a good habitat, all right? So for example, I have something I can do on the board, which is fun, you know. There are 2 ways to make a pond. There's a bad way to make a pond, and there's a good way to make a pond. Bad. Good. We call these good ponds. That's a technical term. And we call these bad ponds. Not true. But there's a lot of my work, I spent 6 years in grad school working with the turfgrass industry, okay? And that means you're working with golf courses and you're reading a lot of golf course research articles. And there was one of the most interesting ones that came out was an analysis of golf courses that used this sort of water feature versus golf courses that used this sort of water feature, and the different species that were, the diversity of the species in those golf courses. You're going to see an interesting example in our ecological economics PowerPoint coming up with land conservancies and conservation easements, where somebody had a conservation easement on their land, something that I'll explain later, and then a golf course bought it and turned it into a company bought it, turned it into a golf course, and then said, don't worry, we're still fulfilling the requirements of the conservation easement, so we still get the tax break because we're a wildlife preserve. You know, we're a golf course. It's not necessarily true. So let's say you're making these features. You can, at the very least, try to make these mesoscale habitats in the best possible way. So what's the difference between this bad design for a pond and this good design for a pond? Does anybody want to hazard a guess? Yes, and then yes. 100%. Same answer? I'm sorry that you've stolen an answer, and so you have to lose 10 points. All right, here we go. So you got a bunch of different plant species that can survive at different depths, right? You've got the fish go here, all right? You've got the crabs go down here. That's what a crab looks like. Very good. As opposed to here, you've got maybe some fish, but not the diversity, the gradation that's necessary for fostering that community. So the fish die, the fish rot, the crabs eat them for a while, and then the crabs die, and then all you've got is a big pool of bacteria that's decaying all the crabs, and you get pretty rapid eutrophication, but not natural eutrophication, where you just exhaust all the oxygen and it's a bad scene. So in developing these habitat types, let's say that you specialize in mesoscale habitat creation of water features. If that's your specialization and you're contracted to do that, you become an expert in that and you understand how different water features are not created equally, for example. The same thing with hedgerows. In different areas, planting different species in these hedgerows will lead to fostering of a different insect community, a better suitability for nesting habitats for the species that live there. So there's a lot of, there's an aspect of design here. That's all I'm trying to say. Okay, here's a more exciting one. I showed you this at the very end of the last lecture. I like this picture. It makes me feel uncomfortable in a nice way. I don't know, it's like comfortable, uncomfortable. This is a scuttled ship, and they intentionally sank it in an area where there used to be a coral reef, and now it's been entirely trawled out, like it's just gone. It's bare substrate. They sink this, it creates physical structure, which used to be provided by the reef, and then you see biodiversity increase. Species have areas that they can affix to, all right? There's hiding areas. It leads to a net improvement in biodiversity. So this is another example of mesoscale habitat creation. Question?
Are there any bad implications to that ship?
Oh yeah. Yeah, if they don't drain it of all the fuel right, for example, that could be a huge problem. It's not identical to the structure of a coral reef, right? You can see. So it's not the same, but based on metrics of based on measurements of biodiversity, if it was there versus if it wasn't there, it's still a marked improvement, right? Yeah, and I'm sure that we can come along some other negative aspects, like what it's built out of might be toxic, you know. Yeah. Yes, please.
Is there like something reason that ships are they like out of commission trips?
Yeah. There's a big question of like, what do you do with these ships that come out that fail? What do you do when a company goes bankrupt and it owns 10 massive ships? Those ships just kind of sit there. All right. So it's pretty wild, pretty wild stuff. So maybe it's better to sink them than to leave them on the surface, you know? Yeah. Or disassemble them, which is, expensive. Yeah.
Is that also like they undergo testing before in order to make sure that they don't have chemicals that would tip it over into the negative effects rather than positive effects?
So my answer here is I would sure hope so. I don't have much expertise in this field. I just know that these projects have been conducted and I've seen the results before and after, and they do serve to create habitat. But the negative impacts and the screening that the ships go through beforehand, I don't have an expertise in, unfortunately. Yeah. Awesome. I like it. Okay, macro scale habitat creation. So you think about a scuttled ship, that's a pretty large, region of habitat. But when we're talking about real macro, like big scale creation, all right, think about a plantation of lumber, okay, or an agricultural field. Now, we don't usually, that's not a macro scale habitat created for conservation purposes, and it certainly doesn't increase biodiversity, right? But what it is macro scale habitat creation. You're just creating a very specific human-centered habitat that's designed to produce product, okay? So usually, macro scale habitat creation involves creating a habitat that benefits, that pays out, okay? Sometimes macro scale habitat creation will be conducted in an attempt to offset destruction at another site. So there can be agreements entered where we own this land that abuts a nature preserve. We need to expand our land and increase the agricultural field or increase the industrial area. But that's going to require that we destroy X acres of protected habitat type. What if we enter into an agreement where we create X times 3 acres of protected habitat type, but in a different area? So those are the sort of agreements that actually can lead to macro scale habitat creation. And as you probably expect, these created habitats have a much higher rate of failure than the naturally occurring habitat that was previously established. So that's all I really have to say about macro scale habitat creation. It's really hard and it doesn't always work. Okay? Cool. Some concepts that have to deal with succession, because we've talked about succession. Remember, I did this. I walked and then I doubled back and I did this thing. And I said, the disturbance hits and it goes back. And then sometimes you just stay in a little loop where you don't actually move forward. Okay? So I just wanted to bring back succession with a fun little, with a more nuanced model of succession that I thought might be kind of interesting. And also I wanted to introduce this term of plagioclimax, all right? Which is, kind of interesting as well. Sometimes humans intentionally arrest succession at a given stage. So think about it as you raise the earth, right? You cut it bare, you till it up, and you plant some seeds, and you're carrying out an agricultural practice. Now, that community that you've established is going to undergo the process of succession. And it's going to move towards a stable community with disturbances. But if it's not disturbances that are keeping you in a sub-climax seer, S-E-R-E, seer is the name we give for the stages of a community moving through succession. They're seral stages, so each one's a seer. All right. If there's a seer that you desire because you're managing an agricultural crop, like you like it when it's all corn. That's your desired seer. You don't want it to move past that stage. You can arrest that through human activity like weeding and pesticides. All right. And you are preventing the introduction of new species or the establishment of new species. That's a specific type of climax community because it maintains stability, called a plagioclimax community, all right? So these plagioclimax communities are when succession gets deflected or arrested by human activities. So it's just an interesting piece of terminology that, we don't really have we can call something an agricultural field, but we don't really have a term for it if we're talking about succession. Because succession is the natural process with disturbances and things moving towards a climax community. So how do we fit something like an agricultural crop into that model, into that terminology? Well, we just make a word and we call it a plagioclimax community. All right? Kind of cool. I just like new terminology sometimes. A question?
What does plagio mean?
Plagio has to do with human. Okay. Let's get the direct definition though online, because it has to do with human. Plagio prefix meaning. Oh, You know, I should have just said, let's just look up our answer. I was totally wrong. Plagio does not have to do with human in this case. We're talking about slanting or oblique. So redirected, right? You slant off the climax, the successional process. Plagio climax. Nice. Okay, cool. Yep, oblique or slanted. Okay, great. Maintaining something in a subclimax state, maintaining something in a plagioclimax state. How do we do it? Graze it, cut it, burn it, clear vegetation from the edges of a swamp or a wetland or a pond. Yes?
If both plagioclimax and subclimax have the same.
A plagioclimax is specifically when it's done by human activity. Subclimax is just when it's about to be at the climax community composition, but it's not there yet. And where we divide each community composition, each seer, is kind of arbitrary, but it's defined. You'll see the redwood forest undergoes this pathway of succession, with the pioneer seral stage being defined as these species. And then the next seral stage is defined as these species with this percentage of cover, you know? So these stages are clearly defined so that everybody can model it the same way and understand the succession the same way. Does that make sense? Awesome. No problem. Over and over again, I'm just trying to emphasize for you, like, hey, there's these pieces of terminology we use, like succession. And oh, it's early succession, it's late succession. But I keep wanting to emphasize that the people who study these things have clear definitions for all of these different terms and all of these different categories so that you can have repeatable data, repeatable results, and everybody can work on this with the same set of vocabulary. Okay. Oh yeah, my clicker's working today, so I don't have to actually press the button. Heterogeneity. Improving heterogeneity and structural complexity. So, we're talking about habitat conservation and pretty intense habitat management, with the most intense being we make the habitat, all right? Another intense one being we prevent the community from moving through succession, stages of succession, okay? Increased habitat heterogeneity is usually considered as a beneficial thing because the more homogenized a habitat is, the less variety it fosters, okay? So what you try to do in increasing habitat heterogeneity is increase the number of available niches. You're broadening the barn, the side of the barn, right? So there's more space to hold snowballs. You don't have to worry as much about the species having niche overlap. If there's more niches, habitat heterogeneity also allows species to specialize maybe and undergo additional speciation, or at least different groups of individuals in different areas within the habitat have different selective pressures on them, so their allele frequencies shift differently, so genetic diversity within that habitat is increased, even if there's no speciation event. Is this all working with the terminology that I've been laying out since earlier? Awesome. I think this is kind of working. Next time, it'll be better. But this time, it is my mentor here when I first started working here would always say, John, it's good enough for government work. Whenever I was like writing up a lab or grading something, it's good enough for government work. And, you know, a weird thing for your academic mentor to tell you, but he's retired, so it's okay. Yeah. So it's good enough. Here we go. Habitat zonation. All right. So one way of increasing habitat heterogeneity is you take the big old habitat and you break it up into specific zones. All right. So just number the zones. All right. And the habitat gets managed differently within the zones, or the management gets offset temporally within the zones. So this region is at successional stage 2 at SEER 2. This region's at SEER 5. So whenever a region hits SEER 5, you harvest and push it back down to SEER 2, and this SEER is now at SEER 4, or this region's now at SEER 4, and this region is now at SEER 5, or the climax community. And so you're able to maintain all of the different SEERs within the broader habitat, all right, by breaking it up into zones. Or alternately, you break the habitat into zones and you manage them very differently, and that leads to more habitat heterogeneity. Ecotone transitions. I think that's a word that's new for our class, maybe? But here's the great thing. I already drew a good pond. And a good pond is good, partially, because it has what we call an ecotone. And an ecotone is a region where conditions are gradually changing. So in this region of the pond right here, you're gradually transitioning from a terrestrial habitat to an aquatic habitat, right? And this region of general transition, these ecotones, tend to foster a ton of diversity because you've got species from the terrestrial trying to creep in, experiencing very different selective pressures. You have species that specialize for these ecotones. And what else does this kind of look like? It kind of looks like a buffer zone, right? Yeah. So the idea is when you've got these two zones butting up against each other, you want to allow there to be some sort of essentially edge effect or buffer so that you can generate that ecotone, which is the gradual transition between two habitat types or between two ecosystem types. Those ecotones are important, and that's a good general piece of wisdom if you're ever doing landscape ecology or landscape management, is you want ecotones. Ecotones also good! Exclamation point. Okay. Habitat zonation, okie doke. And then we've got this concept which I've already been touching on of differential management. You just manage the areas differently. Okay? So exactly what I was saying before of you're essentially introducing a disturbance. You are diverting from succession. You're moving it backwards a little bit, but you don't do it the same for all of the different forest areas that you're managing. Or you don't manage every pond the same if you've got an area that's got a lot of ponds. So you had an area, you're trying to recover you're trying to take, this will work with our ecological economics thing. There's a pasture used for raising cattle. The owner of that pasture dies and grants it to the state and says, this is now yours. I want you to make it a nature reserve. All right? And they go, okay, cool. What can we do to sort of foster biodiversity in this area, get succession moving in the right direction again? So they say, well, there used to be ponds here. Let's make a bunch of ponds. Let's make them good ponds with ecotones. Awesome. Now we've got 8 ponds in this old pasture. We could theoretically manage each one exactly the same, go out and sample, and if there's some eutrophication occurring, we dredge it, we do something like this. Or you could manage the ponds differently. So this is differential management. So you've got all of these different ponds in your habitat, okay? But by managing them differently, you create heterogeneity once again. So this is all about improving heterogeneity. Structural complexity relates to physical structure and is usually used when we're discussing forests. So when people describe an old growth forest, they'll say one of the major benefits of an old growth forest is it has structural complexity as well as high biodiversity. But structural complexity is actually about the trees go in weird ways and they have a bunch of like crotches on them and they have flattened out areas and they've grown for a long time. And so there's a lot of nesting sites and standing dead trees where insects live and fungus can grow and birds can make nests and vines can climb and all of these things. So that's a discussion of structural complexity or structural diversity, which is different from genetic diversity or species diversity. Does that sort of make sense? Something to consider. It's still biological, but it wouldn't be captured by any of the measurements of species diversity that we've talked about so far in the class. I'm moving my hands a lot today. How's that working for people? Feels dynamic? All right, I'm gonna keep doing it. Thank you. All right, great. Examples are here. There's other things you can think of course. Habitat grading, managing environmental gradients. So, gradients in light and temperature, the profiling lakes to create a depth gradient. There it is in text. Here it is right here on the board. One of the things that we started with at the very beginning. So habitat grading, you're attempting to create essentially ecotones. Cool? All right. Rotational management, we already spoke about a little bit with rotational grazing, right? Where you let the plants graze in different, You let the plants, you let the animals, you let them graze in a given area, and then you rotate where they're allowed to graze. Solid. You can also take a large agricultural area, all right, or a large habitat area, if it's being aggressively managed, and you can try to prevent there being a monoculture. So you have different plants planted in different areas. If you're doing an agricultural field, you grow different crops in different patches, or what's even better is you do crop rotations, okay? So I know we're getting into agricultural stuff a little bit, but that's where ecology comes from. And I know it's an environmental science class, but my background's in ecology, and so I just can't help myself. I keep creeping into just doing ecology stuff. But what can we do? We can make changes in the future, but not now. We're already stuck. I've gone too far. Here we go. Rotational management. So this is one of those techniques for making agriculture more sustainable, is you grow one crop for a given amount of time, and then you switch it out to a different crop. All right, you can grow it in exactly the same area. And this is beneficial because you prevent some of the negative impacts of the monoculture, like pests, okay? All right, I'm gonna introduce you to a few old school habitat management techniques like coppicing, which will be pretty cool, I think. Great. So in this rotational management, same area, rotate out what is living there. Okay, great. Man, that is a gross slide. That is so much text. Habitat heterogeneity. This is another point talking about the benefit of habitat heterogeneity. There are plant species that have complex life cycles, and they are mobile species, right? So we've got these, Sumer. There's not only is there too much text here, but there's a typo. It's brilliant, okay? So look at these black bears go upland in Sumer and to lower elevations in the winter. That means that the habitat has to be managed in a way where you recognize this, and you have suitable habitat at high elevations and at low elevations, which is heterogeneity in the habitat. So you're fostering heterogeneity, and it benefits species that have complex life cycles, okay? Where their different stages require different conditions. All right? Reasonable enough? Yes. You know what? It's not a typo, actually. They have to go to Sumeria? Sumer, that's what it's called, right? So they have to they have to go over there. They get on a plane. That's important, yeah. But they have the bears use old maps. That's why it works. Yeah. All right. Cool. So another reason that increased habitat heterogeneity is beneficial. Hopefully, I've bumped into it enough times that you get the takeaway of a more heterogeneous habitat is better than a more homogeneous habitat. Just like a more heterogeneous community is usually considered as better than a more homogeneous community. And just like how what we're really trying to combat by maintaining biodiversity in all of these conservation efforts is we're trying to combat biological homogenization, where the entire globe has the same 20 species that fulfill the 20 essential functional roles in the ecosystem. You want there to be variability, genetic diversity, so on and so forth. Oof. Rotational heather burning, coppicing, and pollarding. Okay, this stuff's kind of fun. So in areas which are very impacted by humans, okay, human activities going on there, what can we do to allow other species to thrive and survive along with us? So right here, we've got the example of the red grouse and rotational heather burning. So a heather forest is a specific type of community, and therefore it undergoes its own specific seral stages as it goes through succession. Heather's defined based on the different species types that are there. There has to be a certain proportion, just like any other community type like this. And this is a big discussion in UK ecology more than in US ecology. A question? It has to have heather present, but that's not the only requirement. The community type, let's actually, I do have the slide. I don't have the slide. That's okay. Let's just, boom. Ecological definition of a heather community, applied ecology. I would love to just get a simple, nice, I've got the image saved somewhere where we've got an actual definition. Damn it. Heather isn't always the dominant species in these heather communities. Dang it, I thought I had the slide. Sorry. Yep. Thank you so much. I do appreciate it. It's essentially a shrubland, okay? Great, but the key is, with any habitat type, with any community type, it must have a very specific definition so that every ecologist can go measure the community composition, measure the height of some plants, the relative cover of some plants, and say, this is defined as a heather, all right? So in the UK, managing these is a big thing. They're always talking about heathrows and heathers and all of this stuff, all right? But check this out. We've got the red grouse. It requires heath land, but different stages of succession of the heath land support different stages of support different aspects of the red grouse's requirements. All right? So the late successional heather gives nesting sites. The mid-successional heather fosters insects that are essential for a food source. The early sears of the heathland, all right, support berry-producing plants, which are an essential food source as well. But the berries aren't available year-round, so the insects sort of supplement when the berries aren't available or when the breeding season hits and caloric requirements are way higher. So you need there to be heterogeneity, and so one of the practices that's conducted is you do rotational burning or cutting. All right? So you just select some portions. You're increasing heterogeneity here. You select some portions of the heathland and you either burn it or you cut it back. So you are pushing it back to an earlier sear. Reasonable enough? All right, great. Now, normally that disturbance would be happening naturally, and so you would have these different habitat patches, and the heterogeneity would be acceptable. But because of the proximity of humans to these areas, we suppress the natural disturbance and then have to implement an artificial disturbance. And something like the cutting, that could be removing a bunch of nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, etc., from the system if you cut the plants back and then remove the material away, which is one argument for why we might burn it. But then burning material, has its own impacts. Okay, rotational heather burning. Next, we've got coppicing and pollarding. All right, kind of cool stuff. These are long-standing traditional practices of cutting back plants to get them to produce more early growth, okay, rather than allowing them to fully mature to get big mature trees, for example. So around here, it's done with willow. Okay, you cut it back, you get the tender growth, and then it's more pliable. You're able to use it for more purposes. All right. So also, while these can be used for product, all right, the material itself is the product that you're using. It's the material you're using. It can also be done to change the habitat that the tree offers. So you'll see that this example here of coppicing, okay, you let this plant grow, you cut it back to almost ground level, and boom, it spreads out. It makes a lot of small, makes a lot of smaller growth rather than one center like bowl of a tree, all right, or one big massive main trunk. And you can see how this gives you some understory structural complexity, right, as opposed to a bare understory that's all shaded out. It's a very different habitat type. So if the community has adapted to disturbance and having trees growing at this level, well, then you can artificially maintain that by coppicing the trees. Pollarding, all right, usually involves, it's a similar process, but there's a taller bole, all right, involved here. The benefit there is it's above the grazing height of animals, so animals can graze this stuff. But if you let the tree grow to a certain height, and then you chop it all back and let the new growth come out, that's pollarding, and that has, the benefit of animals can always graze on it. Yes?
Isn't it the only difference between the two is how tall the
Yeah, if you allow it to have an actual trunk or not. If you cut it back to ground level or if you let it grow a little taller. And, traditionally, these were done for more practical reasons, okay? Or originally, these were done for more practical reasons, but they were done for so long that communities adapted to the presence of these structures. So now, in more directed habitat management, how difficult is it to go out and still pollard and coppice a little bit, Or do we just recognize that these practices are actually beneficial for the health of the landscape? All right, that's the hope. And then we don't prevent or put regulations on traditional practices like this that are actually beneficial. So you implement them more, you reintroduce these management practices, even if necessarily you don't need the charcoal anymore, all right? So these are UK examples, once again. Even if you don't need the charcoal anymore, you still carry out the practice because you recognize that it makes habitat. Anyway, that's kind of cool. Woodland rides, all right? These are these big trails that were cut through the forest, all right? So all three, these two examples, not all three, but these two examples here, the coppicing and pollarding, and the woodland rides, they were all originally done for one reason, and now we've recognized the benefit of the structure or of the practice. So the woodland rides, they were just, big strips of cleared space, and you went and you rode your horses out there, okay? But what happens if you continue making these woodland rides? Well, for one, maybe you get ecotourism. We got I lived in a beautiful town. It's a great place. It's a bunch of, secondary growth forests that have been left alone for a long time. And there's a timeshare company. And they bought a bunch of land out there. And they created woodland rides. And now they run sleighs through them in the winter. So they created woodland rides for ecotourism. And they made a big golf course. And we used to ride our bikes onto the golf course, and we were trouble, I'll tell you. We would wait for them to hit the balls, and then we'd go and grab them and throw them into the water features. Because we were so bad. Anyway, I only bring it up because I'm a little bit nostalgic for those times, and also, that's a real-world example of the creation of woodland rides. It's a linear feature, it's a strip of forest that you remove, and what does doing something like this create? Well, in the negative aspect, it creates maybe some edge effect, but what else does it make? That's right, folks. It makes an ecotone. So it all comes back to the good lake, all right? So you've got this. They've determined, here's the best width of a ride to prevent edge effect from negatively impacting the trees at the woodland edge, but also allow some other plants to persist. So you've got a forest, and you're not gonna fully reset it to earlier stages of succession, even though that might be beneficial with, rotational management or zonation and then managing zones differently and letting them reset to encourage a more natural state of what we call dynamic equilibrium. But instead, you're like, hey, we can sell this. Sleigh rides for the kids. Build a linear feature. Build a woodland ride, okay? And then the landscape ecologist says, well, that's also beneficial because there's going to be a crack in the canopy. There's going to be some opportunity for the growth of scrub and flowering plants, insect food sources, maybe nesting sites, but regardless, you get more heterogeneity, all right? Anyways, that's the woodland ride right there. You can ride the woodland all the way to profit, all right? Cool. Good stuff. So, as we sort of established, it's very difficult to it's very difficult to mimic natural processes of succession. We would love to go into a pasture and then make it be the subclimax stage that provides a bunch of benefit. But we can't just transfer over a bunch of structurally complex, dead standing trees and then shove them into the soil, all right? You need the natural process of succession. So one other way, long-term solution to this is reversion. And in reversion, you say, this community composition, this habitat type that is here right now, we'll go back to the example of the cow pasture. It's not naturally here. It underwent a strange pattern of succession, and now we have a habitat that doesn't really serve the species that are here. Maybe it could even possibly foster invasive species, non-native species that we don't want to spread into this area. So you revert it. You say hard reset. You cut it all back, all right, and then you plant a mixture of native early successional species, maybe even later successional species that have long-lasting seeds. You sow those into the seed bank, and you hope that the natural process occurs, all right? So what can you do to make this faster? You can modify the soil, so you're already kind of going back on what you were trying to do, but you can modify the soil, reintroduce organic matter that was depleted through the agricultural practice, reintroduce soil nutrients, all right? Change the structure up like that. prevent grazing animals from coming there, don't let machinery go into there, deep turning the soil as you add amendments in. These are all ways to try to undo the effects of the aggressive management that was done previously. And so as we've been talking about this habitat management, I've been drawing a lot from a different textbook, and I like doing this because it kind of mixes up our perspectives. As I mentioned previously, this is a textbook on applied ecology from a UK publisher, all right? And so they've got different issues that they run into in their management. One of the biggest ones being a lack of undeveloped space, right? So reversion schemes are kind of one of their outs. Like, they've been managing this area for one way for so long, we want it to go back to what we would expect the more natural system to be. So their priorities can be different sometimes, which is, interesting. Okay, well, we've hit our time limit. There are 3 slides left. So we'll crush these last 3 slides on Monday. Agri-environment schemes, the public and in situ conservation, which is basically let the public go into one place and don't let them go into other places, all right? And then how all of these initiatives require evidence. So if you're ever involved in implementing any of these, always include a piece in your plan where you're collecting data to show that it worked, because you need evidence later if you want to do it again. The end. See you all on Monday. Don't forget about the discussion and doing your annotated bibliography. It was so good to see you all again on a Friday, and have a great weekend.